The first shock was the silence. For years, their world had been defined by a relentless, percussive symphony, the thunderous barrages of artillery, the staccato cracks of small arms fire, the earth-shaking rumble of panzers, and the deafening roar of close air support. Their ears rang with the perpetual tinnitus of war. But now, as they shuffled in their worn-out Feldgrau uniforms, their hands raised or clasped behind their heads, a new and unnerving sound descended, the quiet of surrender. It was a silence so profound it felt louder than the battle itself. This was the moment of capture, the end of their war, and the beginning of a journey so unimaginable that their minds, conditioned for combat and survival, could not yet process its destination. Their captors, the American GIs, were a study in contrasts. These were not the haggard, desperate men of the Eastern Front, nor were they the rigid, ideologically possessed SS fanatics they had been taught to expect. They were well-fed, confident, and moved with a casual, almost unsettling efficiency. Their equipment was new, from the sleek lines of their M1 Garans to the rugged jeeps that seemed to be everywhere. The process was methodical, a quick, professional frisking for weapons, the stripping of watches, medals, and personal keepsakes, the final, symbolic severing from their former identities. There was little malice, but a firm, impersonal finality. They were no longer soldiers, they were assets, units to be processed. For men raised in a culture that prized military honor above all, this demotion to mere infantry was a profound humiliation. The initial holding pens were chaotic, open fields encircled by wire and watchtowers. Here, the reality of their new status set in. They were the defeated. Rumors, that ancient currency of the soldier, swirled through the ranks with the speed of a plague. Some whispered of being shipped to brutal labor camps in Siberia, a fate considered worse than death. Others spoke of summary executions, a final revenge for a war they had been told was forced upon Germany by a world of enemies. The Nazi propaganda machine, which had sustained them for so long, now tormented them with visions of a vengeful and sadistic foe. They had been taught that the Americans were a mongrel people, soft from peace and decadence, incapable of the kind of hardened resolve the German soldier possessed. Yet, the GIs guarding them, while vigilant, did not behave like brutes. They shared cigarettes, handed out K-ration tins, and looked upon their prisoners not with hatred, but with a kind of weary curiosity. This dissonance between what they had been told and what they experienced was the first crack in their ideological armor. The order to move came, and they were marched in long, grey columns toward the coast. The sight that greeted them there was beyond comprehension. It was not a few scattered transport ships, it was an armada. Their harbor was a forest of masts and smokestacks, a solid wall of steel-grey hulls stretching as far as the eye could see. Liberty ships, tankers, and troopships crowded the water, their sheer numbers speaking of a productive capacity that defied belief. For men from a nation where every resource was rationed, every piece of machinery precious, this spectacle of maritime plenty was a silent, terrifying lesson in scale. They were herded up the gangways, packed into their holds that still smelled of American soldiers and cargo, and the great steel doors clanged shut. The sound was the definitive end of their connection to Europe, to the war, to everything they had known. The transatlantic voyage was a journey through a psychological limbo. Confined below decks, the air thick with the smell of sweat, seawater, and fear, they had nothing but time to think. The ship, a microcosm of American power, was a marvel. It was robust, well-maintained, and plied the U-boat-infested waters with a disconcerting lack of concern. They learned later that these convoys sailed with such overwhelming naval and air cover that the once-feared wolfpacks had been rendered nearly obsolete. This was a far cry from the desperate, heroic narratives of the Kriegsmarine they had been fed. Each tremor of the ship's engines, a steady, powerful thrum through their hull, was a reminder that they were in the hands of a nation for whom this vast oceanic expanse was not a barrier, but a highway. As days bled into one another, the initial fear began to morph into a gnawing anxiety about the future. What awaited them on the other side of this ocean? America was an abstraction, a land of cowboys and gangsters from pre-war films, a place of immense wealth they had been taught to resent. They envisioned deserts, sprawling cities of sin, or perhaps vast, empty plains where they would be left to rot. The very uncertainty was a form of torture. Their world had shrunk to the rhythm of the waves, the distribution of meager rations, and the guarded glimpses of an endless, empty horizon. Then, land was sighted. A murmur, then a surge of movement among the prisoners as they crowded against any porthole or railing they could access. The coastline of the United States did not emerge as a gentle line, but as a sprawling, industrial entity. Even from a distance, they could see the skyline of a major city, not the historic, church-spire-dominated skylines of Europe, but a brutalist mountain range of concrete and steel. Smokestacks belched industrial smoke, creating a permanent, hazy twilight. The sheer scale of the port facilities was staggering. Cranes stood like giant steel insects, loading and unloading a countless stream of ships. The air itself tasted different, carrying the scent of oil, coal, and industry. This was the second, and perhaps greater, shock. They had expected a land of primitive camps and wilderness. Instead, they were arriving at the very heart of the enemy's productive power. Their unthinkable journey was over. They had crossed not just an ocean, but a chasm of perception. The silence of their surrender in Europe had been replaced by the roaring, unmistakable sound of a nation at work. They had been transported from a continent being systematically bombed into rubble to the very engine room that was powering that destruction. And as the ship docked, and they prepared to disembark into this new world, a single, terrifying realization began to dawn on the most perceptive among them. If this was what America could produce in peace, what unimaginable fury could it unleash in war? Their journey was over, but their re-education was just beginning. The gangway descended with a final, metallic groan, bridging the last few meters between the familiar, confined world of the troopship and the vast, unknown reality of the United States. A command, sharp and unintelligible in English, echoed from the docks. The journey was over. The processing began. They shuffled forward, a river of gray-green wool and weary faces, their movements dictated by the gestures of American MPs whose faces were obscured by the shadows cast by their helmet liners. The first physical contact with this new world was not soil, but concrete, hard, unyielding, and stretching to the horizon. And then the smell hit them. It was a complex, overwhelming odor that assaulted the senses and signaled a complete break from the world they knew. It was the smell of a nation not at war, but at the peak of its industrial power. The air was thick with the scent of fresh tar, of diesel fumes from idling trucks, and the sharp, metallic tang of rust and welding from the nearby shipyards. Underlying it all was the faint, sweet odor of rotting fruit and grain from the warehouses, and the briny, organic smell of the sea itself. This was not the stench of the front lines, a putrid cocktail of cordite, mud, decay, and death. This was the smell of creation, of immense, untrammeled production. To men whose nostrils had been seared by the acrid smoke of burning villages and the decomposition of no man's land, this industrial perfume was both alien and deeply intimidating. It was the smell of a country so powerful, it could wage a global war without its home territory smelling of it. They were formed into columns and marched from the bustling docks into a more controlled, sterile environment, the processing center. This was not a camp yet, but a factory for human cataloging. The efficiency was breathtaking and dehumanizing. They moved through a series of stations in a relentless, orderly flow. At the first, their few remaining personal effects were taken: a worn photograph, a letter from home, a lucky charm. These final, fragile links to their former lives were dropped into bags and tagged, their fate unknown. Next came the medical inspection. American doctors and corpsmen moved down the lines with a detached, clinical speed. Mouths were opened, eyes checked, limbs prodded. They were dusted with a fine, white DDT powder, the chemical cloud settling on their uniforms and hair, a ritualistic cleansing against the lice and typhus they had brought from the European battlefields. Their message was clear: they were not just prisoners, they were vectors of disease, contaminants to be sanitized before entering the American ecosystem. For soldiers who had once believed in their own racial and biological superiority, this medical processing was a profound, silent rebuke. Then came the most symbolic act of their demotion: the exchange of clothing. Their Feldgrau uniforms, threadbare and stained with the grime of a lost campaign, were taken away to be burned or repurposed. In their place, they were issued identical sets of POW fatigues. The fabric was sturdy, a dark olive drab, and on the back of the jacket and the legs of the trousers were stenciled large, white letters, PW. The uniforms were clean, warmer, and in better condition than what they had worn for months. Yet, this act of provision was the final seal on their status. The insignia of the Wehrmacht, the eagles, the collar patches, the unit badges, were gone. Stripped of their ranks, their medals, and now the very clothing that identified them as soldiers, they stood anonymous, a mass of identical men defined solely by those two damning letters. They were no longer Unteroffiziers or Gefreiters, no longer proud members of the 21st Panzer or the 352nd Infantry Division. They were PW number 18432, PW number 18433. It was in the holding barracks, while awaiting transport to their permanent camps, that the despair began to crystallize. The initial shock of capture and the surreal nature of the transatlantic voyage had provided a kind of mental buffer. Now, in the stark silence of a wooden barracks on foreign soil, the full weight of their situation crashed down upon them. The bravado and the rumors evaporated, replaced by a heavy, palpable gloom. They sat on the edges of their cots, the new PW uniforms feeling like a convict's garb. Some stared blankly at the walls, their minds 1,000 miles away, replaying the moments of their capture, the faces of comrades left behind. Others wrote letters they were not sure would ever be sent, struggling to find words to describe the indescribable to their families. How could one convey the scale of the port they had seen? The sheer number of ships. The unsettling, quiet confidence of their captors. The most crushing realization was the totality of their defeat. They had been told of secret weapons, of a divided Allied coalition that would inevitably shatter, of a Führer who had a master plan to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But here, in the heart of America, such fantasies withered and died. The evidence of a boundless, functioning industrial power was all around them, even through the barbed wire. They heard the constant, distant hum of machinery, the shunting of freight trains that ran on a precise schedule, a stark contrast to the bomb-shattered, chaotic rail networks of the fatherland. They saw well-fed, healthy American guards who seemed to want for nothing. This was not the enfeebled, decadent nation of Nazi propaganda. This was a colossus. And they, the soldiers of the Third Reich, were not noble warriors defeated in a fair fight by a worthy foe, but mere pebbles that had been thrown against a mountain, now gathered up and catalogued by the mountain's keepers. The landscape of their despair was not one of physical deprivation, for they were, to their surprise, fed and sheltered. It was a psychological landscape, a terrifying, vast emptiness where their entire worldview, their purpose, and their future had been erased. They had arrived in America, and in doing so, they had finally, truly, lost the war. The march from the processing barracks to the railway yard was their first true exposure to the American continent. It was a journey of only a few kilometers, but it stretched their capacity for understanding to its absolute limit. They had been told they were being taken to a camp, and in their minds, they pictured a remote, Spartan facility, hidden away in some desolate corner of the country. They were entirely unprepared for the spectacle that awaited them just beyond the gates. The column of prisoners, flanked by MPs, emerged from the compound and onto a raised causeway that offered a panoramic view of the entire port complex. And here, the world simply stopped. The scale of what lay before them was so immense, so far beyond any frame of reference they possessed, that it induced a kind of sensory paralysis. Men who had faced Soviet artillery barrages without flinching now stood dumbstruck, their mouths agape, their feet faltering. The guards, understanding the effect, allowed a momentary pause, a silent lesson in raw power. This was not merely a port, it was a mechanical earthquake, a choreographed frenzy of creation and dispatch on a scale that defied human comprehension. The harbor itself was so thick with ships that the water was barely visible. There were hundreds of Liberty ships and Victory ships, their hulls a forest of grey steel. But it was the activity, the relentless, deafening ballet of logistics, that truly shattered their preconceptions. Gantry cranes, like steel dinosaurs from some H.G. Wells novel, moved with a slow, inexorable grace. Their massive electromagnets, capable of swallowing entire railway cars, descended into the holds of freighters, emerging with pallets of tanks, artillery pieces, and crated aircraft. They would swing these immense loads through the air as if they were children's blocks, depositing them onto waiting flatbed trains with an earth-shaking thud that was felt through the soles of their boots. The noise was a constant, overwhelming symphony of industry, the shrieking of metal on metal, the deep-throated blast of ship horns, the staccato puffing of switch engines, and the shouted commands drowned out by the machinery. They saw a convoy of Sherman tanks, fresh from the factory, their olive-drab paint gleaming in the hazy sun, being driven in a continuous stream from our assembly plant directly onto a waiting transport ship. The line of tanks seemed endless, a metallic serpent coiling its way into the belly of the ship. One of the prisoners, a Panzer crewman from the Afrika Korps who had witnessed the might of the British and American forces in Tunisia, muttered in disbelief, "We were told they could only produce 1 tank for every 10 we destroyed. We were told they were of inferior quality. This is a river. We were fighting a river." But the most profound shock was the absence of war. This was the revelation that unmoored them completely. In Germany, every factory, every rail line, every port was a target, operating under blackout conditions, constantly braced for the scream of air raid sirens and the concussive hell of bombs. Here, there were no bomb craters. No blackout curtains. No flak towers silhouetting the skyline. Their work continued unabated, 24 hours a day, illuminated by massive arc lights that banished the night, making the port as bright as day. The cranes worked with their lights on. The trains ran on time, their schedules unbroken by fear. They saw women, their hair tied back in scarves, operating massive forklifts and directing traffic with colored flags. They saw civilian stevedores, laughing and smoking as they oversaw the loading of shells that would be fired at their comrades. There was no sense of emergency, no grim desperation, only the calm, confident application of overwhelming force. This was not a nation on a war footing, this was a nation in its natural, productive state, and it had simply turned a fraction of its attention to the problem of Europe. The comparison to the German homeland was a painful, unspoken thought in every man's mind. They remembered the Ruhr, its cities pounded to dust, its factories desperately trying to produce under a canopy of fire. They remembered the frantic efforts to repair bombed-out railways, the constant shortages of everything from fuel to food, the pervasive smell of soot and ruin. They had believed, with the fervor of those fed a steady diet of propaganda, that the whole world suffered as they did, that this was the universal condition of total war. The ports of America taught them a different, terrifying truth. The war, for America, was not a desperate struggle for survival fought on its doorstep. It was a business transaction, a logistical problem to be solved with breathtaking efficiency an ocean away. The United States was not a participant in the war in the way that Germany or Britain or Russia were participants. It was the arsenal, the quartermaster, the unassailable fortress whose factories were its front lines, and those front lines were completely secure. As they were finally marched down into the railway yard and herded toward their waiting train, the lesson was complete. The brief, staggering glimpse of the port had done more to break their spirit than any military defeat ever could. They had not been defeated by a lack of courage or will. They had been defeated by a system, a cold, impersonal machine of production that could generate destruction on an infinite scale without ever feeling a single one of its effects. The port was not just a place where ships were loaded. It was the beating heart of a neutral giant, a giant that had, with one hand, effortlessly swatted them out of the sky and was now, with that same hand, building the very weapon that would crush their fatherland. They boarded the train as different men. The landscape of their minds had been irrevocably altered, the myth of German industrial and martial superiority lying in ruins, replaced by the chilling, undeniable reality of American might. The freight cars, when the heavy doors slid shut, enclosed them in a semi-darkness pierced by slivers of daylight from the ventilation gaps near the roof. The air inside was thick with the smell of fresh lumber from the car's walls and the lingering scent of livestock and cargo. This was their new mobile prison, a rattling, claustrophobic box that would carry them deep into the continent. The train gave a violent jolt, then another, and began to move, its wheels finding a rhythm on the tracks, a slow, steady clacking that would become the soundtrack to their re-education. They were leaving the coastal frenzy behind, embarking on a journey into the American heartland, a place that existed in their imaginations only as a blank space on a map, vaguely labeled the West. The initial miles were industrial, a continuation of the port's landscape. But soon, the scenery began to change. The factories and warehouses gradually thinned, replaced by something that, for a moment, felt familiar: suburbs, towns, and then open countryside. It was this transition, from the industrial to the agricultural, that delivered the next series of profound shocks. They had been prepared, in a way, for the machines. Nothing could have prepared them for the land itself. The first shock was the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the American interior. In Europe, land was measured, partitioned, and ancient. A farm of 50 hectares was substantial. A journey of a few hours could take you through multiple distinct regions, each with its own architecture, dialect, and character. Here, there were no such boundaries. The train rolled on for hours, and the landscape did not change. It was an ocean of land. Vast, undulating fields of wheat and corn stretched to the horizon in every direction, a green and gold carpet laid over the earth without visible end. They passed through forests that seemed to go on for days, stands of timber so dense and extensive they dwarfed the Black Forest. The sky was different, a broader, more immense dome of blue than any they had ever seen. This was not scenery, it was geography on a mythological scale. The second shock was the evidence of mechanized farming. They saw their machines from the train, distant specks moving through the fields, trailing clouds of dust. As the train drew closer to a crossing or followed a road, the specks resolved into monsters of efficiency. Huge, green John Deere tractors, operated by a single man, pulled plows that turned a dozen furrows at once. Combines chewed through fields of grain, swallowing the stalks and spitting out the chaff in a continuous, flowing operation. There were no lines of bent-backed peasants scything their wheat by hand. There were no women and children gleaning the fields for scraps. Every acre was worked by diesel and steel. A prisoner from a Bavarian farming family, his face pressed to a crack in the wood, watched this for a long time in silence before turning to his comrades, his voice a whisper of disbelief. "One man," he said, pointing. "That one man on that machine does the work of 100 families from my village. And he is not even sweating." This agricultural colossus was seamlessly integrated into the nation's logistics. The train would occasionally slow as it passed through small towns, and here they saw the grain elevators, towering white cylinders that dominated the skyline like cathedral spires. Rail sidings were filled with waiting boxcars, being loaded directly from the elevators. The food that fed the American army and its allies, and the British and Russian civilians, was not the product of a strained, subsistence-level effort. It was the output of a vast, calm, and brutally efficient food factory, its products flowing east on these same rails toward the ports they had just left. The train itself was a marvel. Its speed and smoothness were unnerving. It did not slow for bomb damage or hastily repaired tracks. It maintained a relentless, confident pace, day and night. They learned the rhythm of the American rail system, the long, mournful whistle at crossings, the respectful slowing for towns, and the powerful acceleration back into the open country. They passed immense freight yards, where the sorting of thousands of cars was orchestrated with the complexity of a symphony. The Germans, proud of their own national railway, the Reichsbahn, now saw its limitations. Theirs was a system built for a continent, now shattered by war. This was a system built for a continent that was whole, powerful, and operating at peak capacity. But the most haunting and demoralizing aspect of the journey was the evidence of a normal, peaceful life. As they rattled through countless small towns and past countless farms, they saw the American people. And these people were not at war, not in any way the prisoners understood it. They saw children on bicycles, waving at the train, unaware or unconcerned that it carried the enemy. They saw families eating dinner on porch swings, their tables visible through unblacked-out windows, laden with food. They saw new automobiles parked in driveways, and farmers filling their trucks with gasoline from private pumps. There were no signs of rationing on the scale they knew. No gaunt, hungry faces. No buildings reduced to rubble. The war was a distant abstraction, something happening in the newspapers and in the letters from sons and husbands overseas. For the prisoners, who had come from a world where every calorie was counted, where cities were moonscapes, and where the presence of death was as constant as the weather, this vision of American normalcy was a psychological blow more devastating than any military setback. Their iron horse was not merely transporting them across a physical distance. It was a vehicle transporting their minds across a chasm of reality. With every mile, the propaganda of a weak, divided, and decadent America crumbled into dust. They were not passing through a country at war. They were passing through a continent of such staggering plenty, such unshakable peace, and such immense industrial and agricultural power that their own nation's efforts seemed not just futile, but pathetic. The journey into the interior revealed the true depth of the resources arrayed against them. They had been defeated not by an army, but by a way of life that could produce endless streams of food and machines while its people lived in peace, a reality more terrifying than any weapon. The train journey stretched into days, a relentless panorama of plenty that slowly eroded the last vestiges of their ideological certainty. The initial shock of the open landscape had subsided into a dull, persistent awe. They had understood the concept of farmland, but this was something else entirely. This was not agriculture as they knew it, this was geophysics. This was the systematic, mechanized harvesting of sunlight and soil on a continental scale. The port had showcased American industry, but the heartland revealed its true, foundational power, the ability to feed not only itself but the world, and to do so with an effortless, terrifying abundance that left the German prisoners in a state of profound psychological disorientation. Their destination, the POW camp, was situated not in a desolate wasteland, but in the midst of this agricultural empire. The camp itself was a stark, functional compound of barracks and barbed wire, but its view was of endless fields. And it was here, as they were put to work, that the abstract spectacle seen from the train became a tangible, overwhelming reality. They were assigned to labor details, harvesting potatoes, detasseling corn, or baling hay. It was through this direct, physical contact with the American earth that the final, devastating lessons were driven home. The first lesson was in the soil itself. In Germany, land was precious, every square meter nurtured for generations. The soil was often stubborn, requiring constant amendment and backbreaking labor. Here, the soil was a different entity. As they dug into the earth to harvest potatoes, they found not the thin, rocky soil of many European farms, but a deep, black loam, so rich and fertile it seemed to exhale life. It was soil that had never been exhausted, soil that stretched for thousands of miles with the same staggering potential. This was the legendary Chinozium they had heard of in the East, but here it was unspoiled, untrammeled by war, and worked by machines, not by desperate Osterbater. Their machines were the second lesson. From the train, they had been awestruck spectators. In the fields, they became humble participants in a mechanized ballet. The camp's American foreman, a lanky, taciturn Kansan named Earl, operated the farm equipment with a casual mastery that the German soldiers, many of whom were mechanics and engineers, could only admire. They watched as a single McCormick farm-all tractor, a relatively small machine by American standards, did the work of 20 men and 40 horses without breaking a sweat. It pulled a harvester that simultaneously dug up the potatoes, separated them from their vines and soil, and deposited them into a trailing truck that drove alongside. The prisoner's job was not to harvest, but simply to collect what the machine, in its brutal efficiency, had missed. One of the prisoners, a man named Klaus who had been an engineer at the Krupp works before the war, found himself staring at the tractor's engine during a break. "It is not just the design," he muttered to his comrade, his voice low with a kind of professional reverence. "It is the fuel. They waste petrol like we waste water. At home, we are converting truck engines to run on wood gas because we have no fuel. Here, they use it to power toys for farmers." This was the unspoken truth. American agricultural might was a direct function of its industrial might. The same petroleum that powered the Sherman tanks and the P-51 Mustangs also powered the tractors that fed the nation and its armies. It was a seamless, symbiotic system where energy flowed without constraint. The third, and most psychologically impactful, lesson was the yield. The sheer volume of food they handled was staggering. They filled vast wooden crates with potatoes, each crate weighing as much as a man, and watched as trucks hauled away dozens of them from a single field. They worked in orchards where the branches of apple trees sagged under the weight of fruit, much of which was left to rot on the ground because the market price did not justify the cost of harvesting it all. This casual relationship to surplus was alien to men from a continent where a single rotten potato was a minor tragedy and where every scrap of food was hoarded. They compared it to their home front they had left behind. In Germany, the diet had been steadily shrinking since 1941, ersatz coffee, Kriegsbrot stretched with sawdust, dwindling meat rations. The propaganda had blamed enemy blockades and the necessity of supplying the troops. But here, in the heart of enemy territory, they saw the real reason. The blockades were not the cause of German hunger, they were merely the method of delivery for a pre-existing truth. Germany was starving because it could not produce enough food, while America was drowning in it. The troops they faced were not just better equipped, they were better fed. A well-fed soldier, they now understood, could march farther, fight longer, and think more clearly than a hungry one. The American army was not just a force of men and machines, it was a force of metabolism. Their agricultural colossus was not a separate entity from their arsenal of democracy. They were one and the same. The same logistical genius that moved tanks from Detroit to Le Havre moved wheat from Kansas to Liverpool. The same culture of mass production that built a bomber an hour also built a combine harvester that could feed a regiment. For the German POWs, this was the ultimate demoralization. They had believed war was a contest of wills, a clash of martial spirit. America revealed it to be a simple equation of production and logistics. You could not break the will of a nation that could replace every lost tank, every sunken ship, and feed its people and its allies from a seemingly bottomless larder. The war was not a battle, it was a transaction, and the United States held the entire supply. As they bent their backs in the rich, black soil, they were not just harvesting potatoes, they were harvesting the bitter fruit of their own defeat, cultivated in the endless, fertile fields of a land that had turned the very act of growing food into an instrument of war. The journey from the camp was a short one, a truck ride down a dust-choked road to a sprawling, single-story complex of corrugated steel that hummed with a low, powerful energy. This was not the farm. This was the source of the farm's power, and the power of everything else they had witnessed. This was a canning plant, a factory dedicated not to weapons of war, but to the preservation of the agricultural surplus they had only just harvested. For these men, whose image of industry was the grim, soot-blackened forges of the Ruhr or the desperate, underground assembly lines of the Mittelwerk, the canning plant was a revelation that shattered the final and most deeply held myth of all, the myth of German industrial superiority. The first shock was the light. German factories, operating under constant threat of aerial bombardment, were dark, cavernous places, often hidden in forests or buried underground, illuminated by feeble, sporadic lighting. This American plant was awash in light. Massive windows lined the walls, and from the high ceilings hung rows of powerful electric lamps that banished every shadow. The air, while filled with the steamy, sweet smell of cooking vegetables, was clean. There were no clouds of coal dust, no choking metallic fumes. The floor, made of smooth, sealed concrete, was spotless. This was not a place of grim toil, it was a temple of hygiene and efficiency, a place where the primary concern was the sterile processing of food. The very cleanliness of the operation was a silent testament to a wealth of resources, of electricity, of water, of cleaning supplies, that was unimaginable in the fatherland. Then they saw the line. It was a single, continuous, mesmerizing entity, a river of metal and food flowing through the factory with a hypnotic, relentless rhythm. At one end, raw vegetables were fed into monstrous washing machines. They tumbled out, clean and glistening, onto conveyor belts that carried them past rows of female workers. These women, their hands a blur of motion, sorted, trimmed, and prepared the produce with a speed that seemed almost inhuman. The prisoners, accustomed to the deliberate, heavy labor of metalworking, stared in astonishment. This was a different kind of precision, a fluid, organic precision dedicated to consumption. The prepared food then moved into the grate, shining more of the automatic canning machines. Here, the miracle occurred. Empty cans, arriving on a separate conveyor, were filled, sealed, cooked, and cooled in a continuous, flowing operation that required only a few men to monitor dials and levers. From one end of the machine went in raw vegetables and flat metal discs, from the other end emerged labeled, finished cans of food, still warm to the touch, ready to be boxed and shipped. The entire process, from field to sealed ration, was completed under one roof in a matter of hours. A German sergeant, a veteran of the Eastern Front named Weber, who had supervised a panzer repair depot near Smolensk, felt the foundations of his professional world crumble. He had been proud of the German ability to improvise, to repair a tank with scavenged parts under fire. He looked at this canning line, a system of such flawless, integrated efficiency, and understood a terrible truth. This was not improvisation. This was a higher form of warfare. The Americans had not just mechanized their army, they had mechanized the entire chain of sustenance that supported it. The same engineering genius that designed the transmission of a Sherman tank was applied to the conveyor belt of a canning machine. The same logistical mindset that moved an army across an ocean was applied to moving a green bean from a farm field into a soldier's mess kit halfway across the world. The workers were the next shock. The women on the line, the Rosie the Riveters, of the food industry, were not the haggard, exhausted figures of German wartime labor. They were healthy, well-fed, and dressed in clean, standardized uniforms. They talked and laughed as they worked, their morale visibly high. They were not slaves or conscripts, they were civilians, paid civilians, who were winning the war with their hands just as surely as their husbands and brothers were with rifles. The few male workers, many of them older or with minor physical impairments that exempted them from military service, operated the heavier machinery with a casual expertise. There was no foreman with a whip, no political commissar watching for signs of slacking. The system itself enforced the pace. The relentless, smooth, unstoppable movement of the conveyor belt was the taskmaster. For the prisoners, the lesson was agonizingly clear. This factory, producing not a single bullet, was a more potent weapon than any they had ever seen. It was the engine of the American soldier's strength. While the German soldier on the front relied on ever-dwindling supplies of stale bread and ersatz sausage, the American GI was fed from a system that provided him with a constant, reliable, nutritious, and even varied diet. "A army marches on its stomach," Napoleon had said. The Americans had not just understood this maxim, they had industrialized it. They had turned the act of feeding millions of men into a process as smooth and predictable as the turning of a gear. As they loaded the finished, heavy cardboard boxes onto waiting trucks, each box stamped with the same text, green beans, corn, peaches, they understood the final, chilling reality. The crates they handled were not just destined for American bases. They were part of the Lend-Lease river flowing to Britain and to the Soviet Union. They were feeding the very Russian armies that had crushed their divisions at Stalingrad and Kursk. The United States was not just fighting with its own soldiers, it was fueling the armies of all its allies, strengthening them with a flow of provisions that Germany could not hope to match, let alone interrupt. The myth of the isolated, resource-poor America was dead. The myth of the soft, unmotivated American worker was dead. The factory, this bright, clean, deafeningly efficient temple of food, had killed them. It proved that the war was not a contest of will, but a contest of systems. And the American system, from the farm to the factory to the front, was a perfectly engineered, self-reinforcing organism of plenty. They had come to America as prisoners of war, but in the shadow of the canning line, they became prisoners of a new, devastating understanding: they had been defeated by a can of peaches. The factory floor was a theater, and its actors were a cast the German prisoners could not comprehend. They had been prepared for an enemy nation unified by the grim, fanatical resolve they knew so well from their own propaganda and their own experience. They expected to see a populace bowed under the weight of total war, their faces etched with the same strain and deprivation that characterized the home front in Stuttgart, Berlin, or Munich. Instead, they found themselves immersed in a reality so dissonant, so contrary to everything they had been taught, that it forced a fundamental re-evaluation of who the Americans truly were. The workers themselves, their composition, their demeanor, their very existence, became the most confounding and illuminating spectacle of their captivity. The most immediate and jarring sight was the women. In Germany, the role of women had been rigidly defined by the state as Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. While the war had necessarily drawn women into the armaments factories, it was often framed as a temporary, patriotic sacrifice, not a transformation of society. Here, there was no such pretense. American women were not merely assisting the war effort, they were running it. They operated the massive overhead cranes that moved pallets of raw materials, their hands delicate on the heavy levers. They wielded welding torches on the assembly lines for farm equipment with a skill that rivaled any male welder the German soldiers had known. They were the electricians, the mechanics, the foremen. But it was their attitude that was the most profound shock. They did not carry themselves as victims or as temporary stand-ins for men. They moved with an air of unapologetic competence and a disconcerting confidence. They would converse and laugh freely, their voices cutting through the industrial din. They looked the prisoners directly in the eye, their gazes not filled with hatred, but with a cool, analytical curiosity. To men raised in a culture of rigid patriarchy, this was deeply unsettling. The very foundation of their social order was being challenged by a woman operating a forklift with a casual expertise. It spoke of a society that was fluid, pragmatic, and terrifyingly efficient, willing to mobilize its entire population without the constraints of ancient dogma. This was not a nation clinging to tradition, it was a nation inventing the future as it went along, and it was doing so with the hands of its women. The male workers presented a different kind of puzzle. They were not the grizzled, militarized veterans or the fanatical party members that populated German factories. Many were older, men in their 40s and 50s, whose knowledge seemed deeply rooted in a lifetime of peaceable industry. Others were younger but bore the telltale signs of physical impairments that would have rendered them unfit for military service in Germany: a slight limp, a missing finger, a frail constitution. Yet, here they were, not as second-class laborists, but as masters of their complex machines. They possessed a quiet, ingrained knowledge of mechanics and production flow that came not from compulsion, but from a culture of craftsmanship and technical education. They solved problems with a collaborative ease, gathering around a malfunctioning hydraulic press not with frantic urgency, but with the calm deliberation of men who had the time, tools, and spare parts to fix it properly. This highlighted the most staggering reality of all: their complete absence of war on the home front. In Germany, the war was an all-consuming physical presence. The air was thick with the smoke from bombed-out cities. The streets were filled with rubble, the sound of air raid sirens, and the sight of maimed veterans. The psychological pressure was constant, inescapable. Here, the war was an abstraction. The factory where they worked was producing agricultural equipment, its purpose indirectly supporting the war, but the environment was one of peace. The workers drove their own cars to the plant. They discussed baseball scores, movie stars, and plans for the weekend. They brought generous lunches from home, containing foods, white bread, real butter, beef, oranges, that were unimaginable luxuries in Europe. During their lunch break, the prisoners would sit in a cordoned-off area, eating their own ample rations, and listen to the conversations of the American workers filtering through an open window. They heard talk of new tires for a car, of a daughter's piano recital, of saving for a new refrigerator. There was no talk of bomb shelters. No talk of fallen sons. No frantic speculation about the Eastern Front. The war was a job, a demanding one, but it was not their entire existence. This normalcy, this pervasive sense of a life uninterrupted, was perhaps the most powerful demonstration of American power. It proved that the United States could wage a global war of annihilation without its civilian population ever having to truly feel it. The front lines were thousands of miles away, and the home front was, for all intents and purposes, still at peace. For the German POWs, this was the ultimate cognitive rupture. They had been taught that the strength of a nation lay in its ideological purity and its capacity for collective sacrifice and suffering. America demonstrated that strength could also reside in its normalcy, in its ability to protect the mundane rhythms of daily life even as it unleashed unimaginable destruction abroad. The workers were not hardened by war, they were empowered by their peace. They were winning the war not through fanaticism, but through a calm, confident, and utterly relentless application of their skills, freed from the fear that haunted every waking moment in Europe. The enemy, the prisoners were forced to concede, was not a nation of decadent weaklings. It was a nation of well-fed, highly skilled, and disconcertingly normal people, whose very normalcy was the foundation of an unstoppable military machine. The barbed wire of the camp defined a physical boundary, but it could not block their view. From their barracks windows, from the back of a truck on a work detail, from the very air they breathed, the evidence of a society operating on a different plane of existence was inescapable. They had seen the ports, the factories, the farms. But it was the intimate, casual details of daily American life that delivered the final, crushing blow to their worldview. This was not merely a nation with a powerful army, this was a civilization of such profound and ingrained abundance that its very normalcy felt like a form of aggression against their impoverished reality. The American home front was not a concept, it was a sustained, sensory assault of plenty. The most immediate and constant shock was the trash. The garbage cans at the edge of the camp, filled with the refuse from the American Guard's mess hall, became objects of morbid fascination. The prisoners would see half-eaten cuts of meat, bones still rich with gristle, tossed away. They saw oranges, their bright peels a shocking splash of color in the dull bin, discarded after only a few segments were eaten. They saw entire loaves of bread, slightly stale, thrown out to make way for fresh ones. In Germany, such waste was not just unthinkable, it was a criminal offense. A potato peel was boiled for soup. A piece of bread was treasured until it molded. Here, plenty was so routine that its excess was casually thrown away. The garbage was a more powerful indictment of Nazi economic management than any Allied propaganda leaflet. This plenty was reflected in the bodies of the Americans they encountered. The guards were not just well-fed, they were large. They had broad shoulders, solid frames, and a physical presence that came from a lifetime of adequate nutrition. They grew taller than the average German soldier. Their teeth were straight and white, evidence of childhoods free from rickets and diets rich in calcium. They possessed a seemingly endless supply of energy. They played baseball on their off-hours, running the bases with a vigor that the prisoners, even on their best rations, could not muster. This was the product of the agricultural colossus made manifest in human form. The American soldier was a biological product of his nation's wealth, and his physical superiority was a constant, silent reminder of the metabolic deficit under which the German army had labored. Beyond the camp's perimeter, the view into the small American town was a window into another universe. They saw houses, not apartments. Each house was a detached structure, painted and well-maintained, with a manicured lawn. Nearly every house had a private automobile parked in its driveway. This fact alone was staggering. In pre-war Germany, car ownership was a luxury for the very wealthy. Here, it was a commonplace feature of middle-class life. They saw families piling into these cars for Sunday drives, a frivolous use of precious gasoline that spoke of a fuel supply so vast it could accommodate leisure. The children were the most haunting sight. They were the true children of this plenty. They wore new clothes, not hand-me-downs or uniforms. They rode new bicycles. They played with elaborate toys in their yards. Their laughter carried on the wind, the sound of a generation utterly untouched by war's trauma. The prisoners, many of whom were fathers, thought of their own children in Germany, children who knew air raid shelters as second homes, for whom a piece of chocolate was a miraculous event, whose faces were already thinning from hunger. The comparison was a physical pain. The American child, healthy, safe, and oblivious, was the ultimate symbol of a nation that could project its power globally while insulating its most vulnerable completely. The war was not here. This extended to the consumer economy, which, though tempered by wartime priorities, was still visibly functioning. Through their windows of the town stores, they could see shelves stocked with goods. There were radios, refrigerators, washing machines, and new clothing. While certain items like tires and sugar were rationed, the sheer diversity and availability of consumer goods were breathtaking. They saw advertisements in discarded magazines and newspapers, promising a future of even greater convenience and luxury once the war was won. This was not the propaganda of sacrifice and endurance that filled German newspapers, this was the propaganda of aspiration, promising a return to and even an improvement upon a pre-war life that was already far beyond anything in Europe. For the German POWs, this was the culmination of their re-education. They had understood the military defeat. They had marveled at the industrial and agricultural output. But it was the sight of this peaceful, prosperous, and utterly normal civilian life that finally made the outcome of the war feel inevitable and morally just. They had been fighting to preserve a system that could only offer its people hardship, discipline, and eventual ruin. They were now prisoners of a system whose promise was freedom, comfort, and limitless possibility. The society of plenty was not soft, it was resilient. Its strength was not born from the fear of the Gestapo, but from the collective investment of its people in a way of life worth protecting. The guards did not need to be fanatics, they only needed to be normal Americans, defending the normalcy they saw every day in their own towns. As they looked through the wire, the prisoners understood with a chilling finality that they had not been defeated by a rival ideology, but by a better reality. The initial stages of captivity were defined by a brittle, defensive pride. They were soldiers of the Wehrmacht, heirs to a tradition of martial excellence, defeated by circumstance, by overwhelming numbers, by the treachery of fate, but not, in their hearts, by a superior foe. This pride was the final fortress of the mind, a citadel built upon years of indoctrination and battlefield experience. They clung to the image of the American as a competent but shallow fighter, a technician without heart, a mercenary lacking the deep, spiritual commitment to a cause that defined the German soldier. He was, in their estimation, a formidable instrument, but one wielded by a decadent and divided society that would inevitably fracture under pressure. The journey into America, however, was a protracted siege against this mental fortress, and one by one, its walls began to crumble. The psychological dismantling was not a single event but a cascade of realizations, each one chipping away at a different pillar of their belief system. The first pillar to fall was the myth of American weakness. The propaganda had been explicit: America was a mongrel society, riven by ethnic strife, weakened by jazz and consumerism, its people incapable of the collective sacrifice necessary for total war. The reality they witnessed was the precise opposite. The sight of women working seamlessly alongside men, of black and white laborers operating the same machinery, of a society that had mobilized its entire economic might without resorting to the whip of a secret police or the crutch of fanatical ideology, revealed a terrifying form of strength: unity through purpose, not through fear. The enemy was not divided, he was, in his pragmatic, pluralistic way, more unified than the Reich, whose internal conflicts between the party, the SS, and the army were an open secret. This led directly to the collapse of the second pillar, the belief in German industrial and technical superiority. They had taken pride in the Tiger tank, the Me-262 jet, the V-2 rocket, masterpieces of engineering, produced in heroic, desperate numbers. But America did not produce masterpieces, it produced a flood. The genius was not in the individual tank, but in the system that could produce 50,000 Shermans. It was not in the exotic jet fighter, but in the thousands of Mustangs and flying fortresses that blackened the sky. The American approach was not about quality over quantity, it was about making quantity a quality in itself. A prisoner who had been an engineer at Siemens expressed it with bleak clarity: "We built a Stradivarius." They built a million serviceable violins, and every one could play. In an orchestra of millions, which is more powerful? Their own technological marvels were now seen not as symbols of superiority, but as desperate, resource-intensive anomalies in a war they were losing to a nation that had perfected the art of the average. The most profound psychological shock, however, was the re-evaluation of the American character. The soft American they had been taught to despise was a phantom. In his place, they found a people who were disconcertingly calm, confident, and competent. The American guards did not need to bluster or brutalize to assert their authority was a simple, unassailable fact, backed by the entire weight of the society that stood behind them. There was no hatred in their eyes, only a quiet assurance of their victory. This lack of fanaticism was, paradoxically, more intimidating than the fervor of a political commissar. Fanaticism could be met with fanaticism. But how did one combat this placid, overwhelming confidence? How did one argue with a system that delivered such tangible results: full stomachs, working machines, peaceful towns, without ever needing to raise its voice? This forced a painful, inward turn. The enemy was no longer a caricature. He was a farmer on a tractor, a woman on an assembly line, a mechanic fixing a truck. He was normal. And in his normalcy, the prisoner was forced to confront the abnormality of the world he had left behind. The stories of SS atrocities, once dismissed as enemy propaganda, now began to surface in their conversations with a new, horrifying plausibility. The relentless bombing of German cities, which they had seen as pure terror, now appeared in a different light, as the logical, industrial-scale response to the war their nation had started and waged with such brutality. A deep sense of shame began to mix with their despair. They had been not just defeated, but complicit. They had fought for a regime that promised a 1,000-year Reich, while their captors lived in a present that was already more prosperous, more free, and more sane than anything the Reich had ever offered. The final stage of this psychological journey was a silent, collective crisis of faith. The ideology of National Socialism, which had provided the framework for their world, lay in ruins, exposed as a lie by the overwhelming evidence of American reality. They had not been the vanguard of a superior culture, they had been the attackers of a more successful one. This realization did not arrive with dramatic conversions or loud proclamations. It settled over the camp like a fog, visible in the 1,000-yard stares of men lost in thought, in the hushed conversations that no longer spoke of eventual victory, but of survival and a return to a homeland that no longer existed as they remembered it. The enemy had won not just on the battlefield, but in the realm of ideas. They had been captured by the Americans, but they had been conquered by America. Their psychological impact was total. They had been forced to re-evaluate the enemy, and in doing so, they were compelled to re-evaluate themselves, their nation, and the very cause for which they had been prepared to die. The war ended not with a bang, but with a paper. The news, when it came, was met not with jubilation or despair, but with a profound, weary silence. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12. The final, frantic broadcasts from a Führer bunker were replaced by the calm, authoritative voices of Allied announcers. For the German prisoners in the American heartland, the announcement of surrender was an administrative formality, the official stamp on a defeat they had already fully internalized. Their war had ended months ago, in the canning plants, on the endless plains, and in the quiet, prosperous streets of a nation they now understood they had never truly known. Their journey back to a shattered continent would now begin, but they would carry with them a new and burdensome knowledge. They were not just witnesses to their own defeat, but the first emissaries of a new global order, the American century. The process of repatriation was a mirror image of their arrival, but the men who boarded the ships were fundamentally altered from those who had disembarked. They were healthier, their bodies restored by a year of consistent, ample rations. But their minds bore the scars of a psychological upheaval more lasting than any physical wound. They had been deprogrammed not by re-education lectures, but by the overwhelming, undeniable evidence of their senses. As they lined up for the return voyage, their conversations were no longer of politics or military strategy, but of the mundane wonders that now defined their understanding of power, the effortless turn of a tractor's key, the unending flow of food from a factory line, the simple, staggering sight of a child throwing away an apple core. Their legacy was not one they would formally record. It would not be found in official histories or veterans' memoirs, at least not directly. Their legacy was to become a silent, subversive current in the rebuilding psyche of post-war Germany. They were returning to a land of rubble and ghosts, to cities hollowed out by a war they now saw as a catastrophic miscalculation. Their families and neighbors would speak of hardship, of the terror of the bombing, of the cruelty of the invading armies. And these men, these former soldiers, would listen. And then they would speak, not of battles, but of bonds. Not of heroes, but of harvests. They would describe the American farmer who could feed 100 men without sweating, the American factory that built prosperity as easily as weapons, the American town that had waged total war without hearing a single shot fired in anger. This testimony would become a powerful, quiet antidote to the poison of the preceding years. In the face of Nazi myths that had led to ruin, they offered a tangible, proven alternative. Their Marshall Plan, when it arrived, would not be an abstract act of American generosity to them. It would be a logical extension of the reality they had witnessed, a nation so productive that it could now turn its capacity to rebuilding its former enemies. They understood that America was not just sharing its wealth, it was exporting its system. The seeds of this future had been planted in their minds as they worked in the fields of Kansas and on the docks of Virginia. They had seen the blueprint for the world to come, and it was a blueprint of networks, of railroads and highways, of electrical grids and supply chains, all operating with the calm, relentless efficiency they had come to respect and fear. For the United States, the experience of housing these prisoners was a minor footnote, a logistical detail in a global conflict. But unintentionally, it had staged one of the most effective psychological operations of the war. The POW camps were not just holding pens, they were display windows into the American way of life. Without a single propagandistic speech, they had demonstrated the core tenets of what would become the post-war consensus, that capitalism and democracy, for all their flaws, could produce a society of such resilient plenty that it could overwhelm any ideology based on scarcity, hatred, and centralized control. The shocked realization of the German POW that they had lost to a better system, not just a bigger army, was a microcosm of the Cold War argument America would soon make to the entire world. Their American century was not proclaimed from a podium, it was built in the factories and farms that these men had witnessed. Its foundation was not merely military might, but the profound economic and psychological dominance that such might requires. The German prisoners, as they dispersed back into the ruins of Europe, carried with them the unshakable knowledge of this dominance. They had seen the engine room of the New World, and they knew its power was not temporary, but structural. Their journey, which began in the dust of defeat and passed through the heart of American abundance, ended with them as reluctant prophets. They returned not as conquering heroes, but as humbled men, bearing the terrible and awe-inspiring news that the future had already been written, and it was written in the language of production and plenty, a language their nation had failed to learn. The seeds of this understanding, sown in the minds of hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, would quietly take root in the soil of a broken continent, helping to ensure that the peace which followed would be built, for better or worse, in America's image.